What's up, everybody? Hopefully you guys are doing great as always. Today I'll be talking about the Caro-Kann, but in specific the advanced variation. Previously I talked about the Caro-Kann classical variation, and if you're interested in that video, then it will pop up on the screen right now. I highly recommend that you watch that video before watching this one, because I'll be talking about some of the differences and similarities between the two. But regardless, let's go. More than 73% of the people that watch my videos are not subscribed. So if you're watching this right now and you are not subscribed, make sure you go down there and hit that sub button. Also leave down below any chess video ideas like tips or traps that you think you would find helpful. So the advanced variation looks very simple to the normal variation, to the classical variation, but rather than pushing out the knight, you just simply, you're faced with the pawn, being pushed forward. And obviously this is so they don't lose the pawn. Now here there's a couple of ways to go about this. I personally really like a more tricky move because a lot of times, especially if you're playing against worse players, they will not know how to handle this move, and it leads to a very tricky position. So the move that I'm talking about is c5, and it looks like you're gambiting the pawn, and I'll obviously go more in depth about this move later on. But the other move that I'm going to be sharing is bishop out here. Now, personally, like I said, I like this move, but if you don't like gambiting pawns, or you want to keep this pawn structure, then bishop out here is also fine. And I'll go over both of these, but let's start with this move here. Now, this is a pretty good gambit, and I think that everyone will admit it, even if you do not really like giving away pawns. The idea is, after this, first off, you've gambited a pawn in the center, so now you eventually will have a lot more control in the center because they only have this one lonely pawn that eventually will be able to probably grab off, and no longer will they really be able to support it if they try to develop the knight, for example. This pawn will be blocked. So this pawn is pretty lonely, and you have two pawns in the center. Also, with the pawn no longer here on c3 because you moved it forward, the knight can find it, or on c6, the knight can find itself on c6, quite easily. And personally, this is a much better position than d7, which it would have been in other variations. Also, obviously, with the move of e6, you are unleashing the bishop to grab it. Now, one big idea that I talked about with the other variation is that you want to develop your bishop before you close off the gate, or before you play e6. But here it's less important because with e6, first off, comes with an attack. So there's a lot of kind of initiative that's going on here. But also with the pawn here gone, the bishop usually can easily find itself here where it will stop some pins that could happen later on. And you'll see that in a lot of the lines that I share, there will be some sort of pin. And so the bishop will find itself here on d7 where it will interfere with the pin. So although still it isn't amazing to fianchetto it because it is still blocked, the bishop usually will find itself in a pretty pleasant position. Okay, so that is not really a worry. Now let's talk about what white might respond with. There's a couple of ways to go about it. The first one is to try to hold on to the pawn, and this is quite a big mistake. For example, if they try to develop their queen, or not develop, but use the queen to protect, then you can simply move out your knight, kick out the queen, and if they try to go ahead and play this move, then you can develop your other knight. And now, if they take and you take back, the queen is still under fire. And so let's say they develop a knight here, try to support this pawn maybe, or just develop a piece to get ready to castle. Then you can now bring out your bishop, like I mentioned, and try to cut off the pin here with the king. Okay, so this bishop usually is very valuable, and usually it will find itself at d7 because no longer does the knight have to go to d7, whereas before, the knight found itself on d7. Okay, and obviously now the queen has to move. They can trade, sure, but eventually the queen will have to move, and then you can move out your knight and unleash this hanging pawn again. Now, if they try to hold on with the pawn, like this, for example, then that is not good either because you can play this move, now threatening to capture this, threatening, once you capture this, to capture this. So they already have some troubles with the pawns. And in general, even if they continue trying to pin, then you can even play a move like this, and now interfere with this pawn, obviously the queen supporting this. In fact, if they take, then once the queen takes back, This is now forking the bishop, so it's very nice. And so there's a lot of mini traps and tricks that you can do here. And even if they try to support it, well, you can trade first off, but you can even just interfere with the bishop, or with the pin here, which now makes this knight usable again, so you could win a pawn, right? So there's a lot of funny lines, and usually you will end up winning this pawn back, or at least one of their pawns. And even if you don't early in the game, then you still have this huge advantage with pawns storming up in the center, and this lonely pawn here that once again will be grabbed eventually, probably. Okay, in terms of where everything will go on the board, usually the bishop, like I said, goes here to interfere with the pin. This knight sometimes goes here if you want to be able to resupply the knight on this square if the queen is here or the pawn is here, for example. But in other cases, once the pawn goes here, you can recapture with the knight. The queen can either recapture or be sent on this diagonal, and you'll be able to castle quite fast with the bishop being able to capture this pawn. And even if the bishop does not manage to capture it, you can still just move out your bishop here. So overall development, in no way is really harmed if you play this move. And although maybe you'll be down a pawn, you'll be up in control in the center, which is why I really like this move. Also, with all the tricks and stuff, most likely you won't be down a pawn for too long. Now let's move on to the second option that I mentioned, which is bishop out here. So in this position, if you decide to take out your bishop, most likely you'll just face some sort of developing move. Let's say they move out their own bishop, and then you can play e6. Now that the bishop is safely out, you can block the bishop. So obviously, the bishop won't have trouble developing. And by playing e6, first off, you can allow your own other bishop to eventually get into the game. But also, a move that I like to play when you play the bishop variation is to eventually also play c5. So once they play a move, for example, like this, developing their other piece and getting ready to castle, then you could play c5. And now, if they decide to take, obviously you can recapture. And I mean, this is just a very big power position for you. I don't know how clear it can be, but this is very, very powerful. You have bishops, you have pawns, and you have knights that will come, and you can easily threaten this pawn here with a move like this. So this is a wonderful position for you. And even if they try to block it, for example, this is still a pretty nice position, and you can still trade, right? If you don't like playing this move, if you really are against c5, then you can simply develop some other pieces and maybe get closer to castling queenside, or even, eventually maybe just hold on for castling now and castle kingside eventually. Because castling is not a huge priority right now because you still have a lot of undeveloped minor pieces. With the aid of the other video that I made, now you should know the advanced variation and the classical variation pretty well, and these two being the most commonly used responses, you basically know the Caro-Kann well enough to at least start testing it out in your own matches. So hopefully you learned something, you enjoyed this video. Make sure you go ahead and subscribe if you aren't already, and comment down other videos such as these opening videos that you would like to see in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.